In the age of marble palaces and velvet tyranny, one woman decided who was worthy of New York itself. Caroline Astor didn't just host dinners. She ruled a kingdom built on silence, scandal, and the ruthless arithmetic of power. She could crown a family with a single invitation or erase them with the flick of her pen. But beneath the glittering chandeliers of old New York, betrayal simmered. Her husband paraded mistresses on his yacht. Her daughter died from an overdose. Another drowned in grief, and her only son, the heir to her legacy, would board the Titanic, never to return. This was not high society. This was war. She battled Alva Vanderbilt, who wielded railroad millions like a weapon, and Mammy Fish, who mocked her rules with outrageous parties where monkeys dressed in suits. Behind velvet curtains, reputations were shattered, marriages arranged like chess moves, and power changed hands over champagne flutes and whispered insults. From the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue to the marble fortresses of the Vanderbilts, this is the untold, unvarnished story of the Queen of the Gilded Age, Caroline Astor, a woman who built an empire of manners and memory, only to watch it crumble into the roar of a modern world she could not control. If you like stories like this, please consider joining the channel. We have over 80 biographies on remarkable women throughout history. Now let's get into the secret world of Caroline Astor, the Queen of the Gilded Age. She was not born to rise. She was born to endure. In the autumn of 1830, when the air on Greenwich Street turned sharp with salt and chimney smoke, a girl was born beneath ceilings shadowed by portraits and silence. Her name was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn, ninth child, youngest daughter, the last breath of a lineage that measured time not in ambition, but in memory. To understand Caroline is to understand that she came from before railroads stitched the nation, before Ellis Island opened its gates, before fortunes were forged in oil, steel, or speed. She belonged to a finer empire, Knickerbocker, New York, where names outlived money and silence carried more than speech. Outside her window, her red brick townhouse at 6 Greenwich Street, the harbor lapped at the battery like a silver tongue, and sails bobbed like linen ghosts against a sky unbroken by towers. New York, then, was not yet the city of hunger or haste. It was a city of names. Hers was already one of them. The Schermerhorns had arrived in New Amsterdam in 1636, when the place was still a Dutch outpost, carved from forest and marsh. For nearly 2 centuries they endured, watching fortunes bloom and wither, newcomers rise and vanish. They did not build dynasties. They preserved them. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, was a shipping magnate, one of the last of the old breed. He made his fortune not by risk, but by steadiness, cargo, timber, grain. A Calvinist who prayed aloud but celebrated nothing. He wore black wool in every season, read scripture at breakfast, and distrusted displays of joy. By the time Caroline was born, Abraham was worth $500,000, a staggering fortune in 1830. Her mother, Helen, descended from the Van Cortlandts and held herself like one of the ancestral portraits in the front parlor, polished, silent, mildly disapproving. She had borne 8 children before Caroline and spoke of them only when required. Her lineage was even older and more entangled in the roots of the island. The Van Cortlandts, the Beekmans, the Whites, not just families, but boroughs in blood. Her great-grandfather was Augustus Van Cortlandt, who had been the last city recorder under British rule. Her ancestors included landowners, governors, and tangled ties to John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States. The Van Cortlandts had owned tens of thousands of acres north of Manhattan and had married into nearly every significant colonial family in the city. These were people for whom lineage was a vocation, the slow, careful tending of a legacy across centuries. They did not strive. They endured. So when Caroline was born on a street once patrolled by redcoats, in a house lit by whale oil and lined with ancestral portraits, she was not merely a baby. She was a vessel, a receptacle for memory. Her name stitched with generations of the dead. Just months before Caroline's birth, her mother had hosted a masquerade ball in that very house. The guests wore powdered wigs, harlequin masks, brocades, and feathers. Candles burned low in Venetian chandeliers. All the old families had been there, the Livingstons, the Joneses, the Bayards, moving through rooms as if rehearsing their place in a vanishing tableau. Caroline arrived into that world 9 months later, born not into chaos, but into choreography. She was not a disruption, she was the afterglow. The house did not rearrange itself around her, it went on. Her birth was noted in family letters, not the press. There were no fireworks, no shrieks, just soft footsteps on polished wood, a lace curtain drawn, the scent of milk and beeswax in the nursery. The house Caroline entered was not grand by new money's reckoning. No crystal chandeliers, no gilt mirrors, no marble staircases. It was a shrine to restraint. Mahogany furniture stood like sentinels in dim rooms. The walls were hung with Dutch silver, ship clocks, portraits of powdered Schermerhorns with unsmiling mouths. The drawing room was not for conversation. It was for presence. She was not pampered. She was not praised. She was not encouraged. She was watched. By 3, she had learned the rules. Sit without fidgeting, rise when spoken to, bow her head when her mother entered. Her governess taught her French, embroidery, psalms. She was given a book of common prayer before she was given a toy. She learned to recognize family crests before she could read the alphabet. Outside New York moved slowly, behind lace curtains and closed shutters. There were no skyscrapers, no carriages lined in chrome. Its power lay in pews and property lines. On Sundays, the Schermerhorns went to Grace Church. Episcopalians, of course, the only acceptable faith for families who considered God a gentleman. In their enclosed family pew, Caroline sat between silence and scrutiny. The Reformed Episcopalian service offered no incense, no ecstasy, just stone, scripture, and the long, unblinking stare of heaven. She watched the people, not the pulpit. Who arrived last, who dressed too brightly, who genuflected too deeply. The hierarchy of the city sat row by row, and she learned it before she could spell her own name. The Reverend did not thunder about sin. He reminded the wealthy that they were custodians of the city's soul, and that generosity should be conducted with the same decorum as dinner service. Caroline absorbed it deeply. She was taught to give, not because the poor deserved it, but because giving confirmed the giver's position. Every coal drive, every orphanage donation, every charity bazaar was less an act of love and more an act of order. After church came visiting. Here, Caroline watched her mother move through the social season like a strategist. Calling hours were fixed. Calling cards, weighted and engraved, were delivered with military precision. A visit too early was desperate. Too long, vulgar, too frequent, suspect. Her mother's ledger, thick with names, thin with affection, recorded every exchange. Who had visited, who had returned, who had slipped. No one was ever called out. They were simply not called on again. Caroline observed this with the silence of a pupil in a private school of judgment. She began to memorize addresses, who had moved uptown, who had redecorated, who had added too much velvet. She noticed which houses smelled of new varnish and new ambition, and which had the still, aged hush of inherited grace. The city was changing, but the Schermerhorn world did not chase it. It receded from it, carefully, deliberately, like a tide leaving only the firmest stones behind. By the time Caroline was 6 years old, she understood something few adults ever grasped. That New York was not a city. It was a map. Not the kind etched in streets and rivers, but in names, pews, parlor walls, and the narrow corridors of social memory. Her world stretched only a few miles, from the townhouse on Greenwich Street to Grace Church on Broadway, from St. John's Park to her uncle's drawing room near Washington Square. But these miles were sacred because they were fixed. Each household had its number, its pew, its silence, and each was known. Nothing was anonymous. Everything was remembered. The old families, Dutch, Huguenot, English, lived in deliberate rectangles of real estate below 14th Street. Caroline's among them. The Livingstons, the Morrises, the Beekmans. Their addresses were not simply homes. They were social coordinates. To move was to decline. To remain was to prove that you still mattered. The Schermerhorns lived near the Battery, in a house that had changed little in 40 years. Their relatives clustered near St. John's Park, a private garden walled off from the public, its keys given only to residents. Washington Square was considered a frontier, and Bond Street a compromise. Farther north lay farmland, and increasingly discomfort, for it was there that new names began to build. Not families, but fortunes. Caroline was too young to express any of this, but she could feel it. She noticed the way her mother's tone shifted when someone mentioned a house on Lafayette Place, or when a family of uncertain background rented on Bleecker. What Caroline saw in church, she practiced at home. In the parlor, she walked with books on her head to correct her posture. At dinner, she answered questions with precision, and never twice. Servants stood at attention, silent as the silver. Emotions were considered vulgar, movement discouraged. Her mother corrected posture with the faintest frown, her father with absence. Caroline understood without being told. The family did not earn its place, it held it. The world outside might grow louder, but their house would not. Names were everything, and hers must never be misused. Ambition could be vulgar. Memory could be power. Stillness was not weakness. It was a weapon. In the early 1840s, New York quickened. The wharves expanded, then spread. Steamships began to outnumber sails. Carriages rattled louder over cobblestone heading north. Broadway pulsed past darkened mansions. Gaslight flickered in shops that stayed open too late. From the upper floors of her family's townhouse, Caroline could hear the difference. The city no longer whispered. It hissed, it clattered, it called. She did not answer. The old families stayed where they were at first. The Schermerhorns still walked to church along familiar routes. They still received the same guests in the same parlors. But Caroline noticed the tension in her mother's posture when unfamiliar carriages stopped at nearby houses, or when names not written in her ledger appeared in society columns. They were names without history, without pews, without silence. The Vanderbilts, the Stuarts, the Goelettes. They had fortunes, but no funerals, no ancestral portraits, no gravestones in Trinity Cemetery. They built mansions on streets that did not yet have meaning and filled them with mirrors, not memories. Caroline did not speak of them, but she listened carefully when others did. They have no discretion, her mother would murmur, folding a fan. They invite everyone, a cousin would whisper. They married money, but they were not born to it. Caroline understood the grammar of these comments. Inclusion was never granted, it was withheld. And it wasn't only the wealthy who arrived. By the mid-1840s, the city filled with other voices, foreign, Catholic, unfamiliar. Irish workers unloading ships, German artisans setting up shops, Jewish families establishing synagogues below Canal Street, the sound of prayer in other languages, the sight of crucifixes where there had only been silver. The city that had once seemed composed now vibrated. The avenues crowded. The nights grew louder. The streets no longer paused for grace. They pulsed for gain. Caroline's walks with her mother grew shorter. Certain neighborhoods were avoided. New streets never mentioned. Her governess adjusted their routes so that Caroline passed only the houses she was expected to remember. The old families didn't retreat. They repositioned. In 1840, the Schermerhorns left Greenwich Street for a new home at 36 Bond Street, just east of Broadway. It was a move carried out without fanfare, but not without calculation. Bond Street wasn't just further uptown, it was further away, from trade, from noise, from everything rising too quickly. The new house stood among brick townhomes with white marble steps and ironwork railings that curled like handwriting. The neighborhood was quiet, well-kept, and select. Lafayette Place, nearby, had been laid out by John Jacob Astor himself, a genteel development of Greek Revival homes meant to attract the city's best names. The Livingstons lived there. So did the Brevorts. The Joneses, of keeping up with the Joneses' fame, were just blocks away. This was the new heart of Knickerbocker preservation. Not aristocracy in the European sense, but something subtler, sharper. Caroline's education remained quiet, curated, and precise. Her parents did not believe in the ornamental excesses of newer families. No gilded tutors or traveling governesses. They chose instead what old New York valued most: restraint, fluency, control. She was sent to a private school run by Madame Bency, a French émigré who took in only the daughters of proper families, meaning not necessarily the wealthiest, but the most established. There, Caroline studied French language and literature, embroidery, drawing, penmanship, music, and above all, deportment. French was not just elegant, it was required. It was the language of menus, of salons, of thank you notes passed between those who never raised their voices. Caroline absorbed it quickly, and with it the rhythm of European civility. She learned how to curtsy without creasing her skirts, how to glide, not step, how to speak in murmurs that still carried weight. But her real schooling did not come from Madame Benzy. It came from the parlor at 36 Bond Street. There, under her mother's quiet eye, she learned the choreography of status, how to receive a card, how to take a caller's hand with just enough pressure to suggest welcome, but not warmth. She listened to conversations, discussions of who had too much money and too little breeding. It isn't a question of what they have, Helen once told a friend. It's a question of whether they know how to carry it. Caroline understood. Not all wealth was equal. There was a difference between a last name and a name that still opened doors. A family could have millions and still be misplaced. As she approached her debut, Caroline understood the grammar. Inclusion was never granted. It was withheld. She saw the girls from new families. The silk too bright, the laugh too eager, the jewelry worn too early in the day. One forgot to return a visit. Another left a card at the wrong address. A third wore diamonds before dusk. Caroline never corrected them. She remembered them. She was not cruel, she was precise. Her mother still kept the family ledger, initials in pencil, addresses in careful script. But Caroline had begun keeping her own, a private record, memorized, permanent. She remembered who came early, who came late, who came at all. By 16, she no longer needed instruction. She was her own instructor. Her judgments were never voiced, but they were absolute. Inside the Schermerhorn household, permanence was the only power, and Caroline, still watchful, unflinching, was already learning to wield it. What she did not yet know was that one day she would hold New York in her gloved hand, and one day she would watch it slip away, because nothing endures forever. Not marble, not memory, not even Mrs. Astor. Caroline did not arrive with fanfare. She crossed no threshold, no velvet rope, no grand ballroom door. She settled into New York society the way a name slips into memory, softly, but with permanence. At 17, Lena, as her family called her, stood at the edge of the world she had studied all her life. The townhouse on Bond Street whispered its rituals around her, the faint scent of beeswax on mahogany, the hush of curtains drawn against the street, the quiet, meticulous shuffle of calling cards in her mother's ledger. For a Knickerbocker girl, a debut was not a spectacle. There was no glittering ball, no orchestra to herald her entry, no diamonds laid out as a daughter's dowry to the city. Instead, there was hair arranged high for the first time. There was a tea, modest, immaculate, where older matrons studied her posture over the rims of bone china cups. There was Grace Church on Sunday morning, where she took her place in the family pew, gloved hands folded, eyes lowered just so, knowing precisely which gaze to return and which to let slide past like mist. This was the choreography of old New York. Teas, dinners, church pews, carriage drives, each a small, exact step on the invisible staircase to womanhood. Nothing was announced. Everything was understood, the expectations wrapped around her like a second skin. A Schermerhorn girl did not dazzle, she endured. She was expected to hold her place, not hunger for more. To marry rightly, not romantically. To carry the name forward, polished, never altered. But inside Caroline, something stirred that no one saw. She noticed more. She remembered more. She judged more. While other debutantes, daughters of Suidams, Beekmans, Livingstons, fluttered through their first season, Lena watched them with a stillness that unnerved. She saw who danced before listening, who smiled too eagerly, whose family alliances were patched with silk, and whose with silver. The suitors who circled were as prescribed as the season's etiquette. Young men from old families, polite, predictable, proud. They saw in Caroline what they expected, composure, pedigree, the soft-spoken modesty of a Knickerbocker daughter. But Caroline even then wanted something they could not name. Not love, not flirtation, control. She understood almost before they did that marriage was not a romance but a ledger, that society was not a stage but a throne room, and behind every crowned man sat a woman, quiet, precise, unyielding. In the parlor at 36 Bond Street, beneath her mother's steady gaze, where the clock ticked like a metronome of judgment, Caroline owned her deepest education. She learned to accept a hand with welcome but not warmth, to hold a gaze half a heartbeat longer, just enough to suggest memory, never challenge, to incline her head by degrees, signaling approval or dismissal without uttering a word. She saw which girls glowed too brightly, which mothers pressed too hard, which young men hid uncertainty behind polish. Charm, she understood, was a danger. It made one visible, but never invulnerable. Better to master stillness, to become the one who saw, rather than the one who sought to be seen. At teas, she weighed the heft of a compliment by the slant of an eyebrow, the delay of a glance. She knew the architecture of social triumph, and, more importantly, of social ruin. Suitors would come and go. Fortunes would rise and fall. But Caroline had already fixed her gaze on something beyond the moment. She was not merely entering society. She was beginning to shape it. And in the quiet, watchful girl in dove-gray silk, New York would one day meet its sovereign. The woman who would decide who belonged, who ascended, and who, at last, would be left waiting in the cold. By 22, Caroline Schermerhorn had outweighted most of her peers. While other Knickerbocker daughters married at 18, 19, 20, quietly absorbed into the houses of Livingstons, Whites, Joneses, Caroline remained. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, had died in 1850, leaving her as companion to her mother, Helen, in the dark, paneled Bond Street home. Abraham had been a figure of quiet force, a merchant who prized steadiness over speculation, a patriarch who commanded without flourish. His absence left a vacuum, but also a mantle. Caroline was not merely waiting for a match. She was studying the field, and then came William Backhouse Astor Jr. By reputation, he was New York's most eligible bachelor, son of William Backhouse Astor Sr., grandson of John Jacob Astor, America's richest man. But Caroline knew money was not everything. The Astors had wealth, land, banks, steamships, but they did not yet have society. William Jr. was no figure to command a room. Quiet, serious, scholarly, almost shy. He loved books, astronomy, the quiet pulse of inherited duty. He lacked his father's ruthlessness, and Caroline saw that immediately. She also saw something else, opportunity. Their courtship was unremarkable. No poetry, no scandal, no chase. Carriage rides along the Battery, teas in restrained parlors, dinners where conversation slid over silver like water. They were a match that satisfied every ledger. Old Dutch respectability joined to German immigrant fortune, Schermerhorn memory to Astor gold. But while William brought wealth, Caroline brought vision. She understood, instinctively, that this union was more than a marriage. It was an inheritance, not of land or money, but of position. The wedding itself was modest, at least by the standards of the age to come. A church ceremony, old families in attendance, polite columns in the newspapers. No vulgar display, no Fifth Avenue carriages flung open, no fountains of champagne. That spectacle belonged to the Gilded Age, still gathering at the gates. For Caroline, the real ceremony began afterward. She crossed the threshold of her new life, not in silk and lace, but in calculation. The newlyweds moved uptown to a house on Fifth Avenue, a stretch still half-formed, where pastures yielded to stone, gaslights flickered against dark fields, and the future of New York was being built one brownstone at a time. She moved through her new home not as a young bride overwhelmed, but as a sovereign in waiting. She took stock of the drawing rooms, the staircases, the guest lists yet to be written. She understood, with the quiet clarity that had defined her since girlhood, that this was not the end of the game. It was the board. William gave her his name. Caroline would give it meaning. She knew her husband, gentle, reclusive, more enchanted by his telescope than his table, would not be the one to hold society together as the century turned. That task, that crown would fall to her. and beyond the quiet halls of their Fifth Avenue home, New York surged forward. Steamships clattered at the docks. Brownstones rose where orchards once stood. New money rattled the cages of old. The Vanderbilts were building railroads. The Golates were buying land. The Stuarts were raising marble palaces like monuments on corners where meadows once breathed. While other old families clung to the past, she prepared to rule the future. Because what no one yet understood was that Mrs. William Astor, as the papers called her then, would become something more. That the quiet girl from Bond Street, the understated bride of Fifth Avenue, would rise to command not only drawing rooms but destinies. In a city that never stopped hungering, Caroline Astor held something rarer than fortune. She had permanence, and soon she would turn it into power. She rose before the servants, even in winter, when Fifth Avenue's pavements crackled with frost and the gas lamps burned pale against the dawn. Caroline was awake, inspecting the house, her world, her kingdom. The Astor household ran like clockwork, but not by chance. It ran because Caroline willed it. In the first years of marriage, Caroline bore children as she bore duties, with precision, endurance, and the quiet gravity she had carried since girlhood. Emily, the firstborn, arrived in 1854, a solemn-faced infant wrapped in linen and legacy. Helen followed, then Charlotte, then Carrie, then John Jacob, the long-awaited son. By the early 1860s, the Fifth Avenue house rang with the soft chaos of 5 children, their tutors, governesses, and nurses, weaving through rooms lined with brocade and mahogany. But even as she mothered, Caroline remained, above all, composed. She was not a mother who knelt in nursery games or ran barefoot on lawns. She was a mother who shaped, who guided, who expected. At breakfast, the children learned the cadence of the household. Silence until spoken to, posture without prompting, scripture before questions. Afternoons unfurled in the rhythm of lessons, writing, music, French recitations, all under the quiet surveillance of a mother who missed nothing. Caroline loved her children, but she loved them as she loved the Astor name, as something to be preserved, perfected, polished until it gleamed without flaw. When grief came, it came like a hand pulling a velvet curtain tight. Emily, her firstborn, the solemn-eyed child who had grown into a young woman of grace, fell ill in the spring. Doctors came and went, leaving behind the bitter scent of medicines and the hollow echo of reassurances. By autumn, the house stilled. Emily was gone. Caroline did not collapse. She folded into silence, and the silence thickened every room. The Astors spent winters in the city and summers in Newport, where the ocean slapped against the cliffs like a reminder of both wealth and fragility. In Newport, mornings were walks along the cliff path, parasols tilted just so, children instructed not to run too fast, not to laugh too loud. Afternoons brought teas, quiet visits with other Knickerbocker families, carriage drives where Caroline could watch, always watch, the slow encroachment of new houses, new names, new money. New York was changing. She could hear it, even from the sea, the rising hiss of steamships, the hammering of marble on Fifth Avenue, the unspooling thread of the elevated railway cutting through uptown. Central Park had opened. The Bowery roared with immigrant voices. The Vanderbilts and Stuarts glittered at the edge of her world, waiting. Inside her house, Caroline held the old world intact. The dining room gleamed with silver that had crossed from Holland generations before. The servants moved in practiced quiet, bell pulls braided silk, the vestibule tray stacked with calling cards engraved with names that belonged. William Jr. sat in his study, poring over real estate ledgers, tending his telescopes, a gentle absence at the center of their wealth. It was Caroline who animated the house. She decided who was received, who was remembered, who was erased. Drawing the map of society one card, one glance, one dinner at a time. She curated dinners with a surgeon's care. No mismatched guests, no vulgar displays, no chatter of factories or fortunes. Memory, not money, was the currency here. In those decades, she began building, not yet the 400, but the idea of it. She knew instinctively who should be let in. The Beekmans, the Livingstons, the Schermerhorn cousins, the Joneses. Names weighted by generations, not gold. But every day new money came closer. At night, when the lamps were turned down and the house sighed into stillness, she could feel the city pressing in. The clang of iron, the rustle of silk, the restless heartbeat of a metropolis learning to crave spectacle. Her power, for now, was in restraint. She was Mrs. William Astor, mother of 4, mistress of Fifth Avenue, queen behind closed doors. And though the city roared, Caroline reigned, quietly, precisely, in rooms where memory still ruled, where grief was a shadow, where the future waited just beyond the marble threshold. She was not yet the Mrs. Astor the world would fear and admire. But she was already the woman who watched, measured, remembered. The one who knew that to last in a city like New York, you did not race the tide, you became the shore. By the 1860s, Caroline Astor had become the quiet, unyielding center of New York's social world. Not by proclamation, not by spectacle, but by something rarer, permanence. Charlotte Augusta Astor still held the public title of Mrs. Astor. She presided over her grand home on Lafayette Place, where guests passed beneath crystal chandeliers, between gilt-framed mirrors, through parlors scented with orange blossom and age. The furniture gleamed but sagged. The laughter rang but faintly. The guest lists read like palimpsests, the same names, the same toasts, the same stories worn smooth by time. Caroline watched it all as she watched everything, unsmiling, unhurried, exact. Her own home at 350 Fifth Avenue stood just above 34th Street, a towering brownstone set like a citadel on the northern edge of society's march uptown. It was no marble colossus, no carnival of gilded ceilings and painted cherubs. It was a cathedral of restraint. The ballroom shimmered in white and gold, its high mirrors catching gaslight and fracturing it into 1,000 soft flames. The dining room gleamed with French silver and Meissen china, menus handwritten in Parisian script, each course a gesture more than a meal. Parlors softened by silk draperies and Turkish carpets. Crystal vases heavy with hothouse roses, but never too many. Not a single cushion out of place. Not a single decision left to chance. And at the center of it all stood Caroline, immaculate, immovable, the axis on which the city turned. But not everything glittered. Her marriage was its ghost light, dim, enduring, and always there in the periphery. William Backhouse Astor Jr., once the gentle, scholarly heir to America's greatest fortune, had drifted into absence. His pleasures turned inward, astronomy, rare books, ledgers, and outward to the Normahal, his opulent yacht. Light of the harem, they called it, though in Newport and New York it was known for its revels, mistresses, whiskey, music spilling into the water like perfume. Once, anchored off Narragansett, the yacht glowed so brightly with lanterns the sea mirrored the stars, and carriages lined the shore just to glimpse the spectacle. The old families looked away. The new ones whispered and smiled. Caroline held her line. She did not confront. She did not collapse. She perfected the art of omission. Asked why she never sailed with William, she smiled. "I am a poor sailor." When he threatened to arrive drunk at one of her dinners, she quietly dispatched a friend to detain him at the club. When the gossip columns circled, they found no scandal at 350 Fifth Avenue, only the polished armor of composure. Yet even the finest architecture bears strain. In private, Caroline understood. A kingdom may be ruled by silence, but not protected by it. Fifth Avenue, once a stretch of clapboard houses and gaslit quiet, surged with ambition. Across the street, the Vanderbilts were erecting a palace of marble and malachite, its walls gleaming green and white like imperial chess pieces. The Stuarts hosted dinners that roared with orchestras and overtures. The Golettes, the Goulds, the Astor's own junior branches, all pressed closer. Not for an invitation, for inheritance. Inside, Caroline curated every element, the guest list, the menu, the angle of a lamp. She wove each evening like a tapestry. And yet, beneath her heels, she felt it, the faint tremor in the parquet, the breath before the storm. She had been raised to believe that memory outlasted money. But the century had already slipped past her gates. She never needed a herald. But every queen in time attracts a courtier. For Caroline Astor, that man was Ward McAllister. He arrived in New York society with the lightness of a waltz and the cunning of a tactician. A florid, silver-haired Southerner, McAllister had the gift, or the curse, of being remembered. He was theatrical, self-important, irresistible to some, insufferable to others. He loved dinners, loved to tell people how dinners should be done, loved to explain the finer points of social life as if he had invented it. But beneath the posturing lay an instinct as sharp as Caroline's own. He understood what was coming. New York was swelling. Brownstones bloomed uptown like a second spring. Names once murmured in drawing rooms now thundered from stock tickers and shipping lines. Money was not just rising, it was flooding. And society, that delicate architecture Caroline had built on silence and memory, began to tremble at its foundations. Ward McAllister saw it. Caroline felt it. Together. Though they never quite called it that, they began to draw the line. It was McAllister who gave it shape. Who knew that in an age where marble cracked and fortunes vanished, the only true currency was belonging, and who whispered, half in jest, to a reporter one evening that there were really only 400 people in New York who mattered. Enough, he said slyly, to fit comfortably in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The number was a lark, an offhand boast, but the city seized on it like scripture. Who were they? Who made the cut? Who was in? Who was out? The press went into a frenzy. Society hostesses pored over guest lists, seamstresses and caterers and jewelers hung on rumors of the names. The idea took fire, and McAllister, preening, basking, fanning the flame, fed it with just enough detail, just enough mystery to make it unstoppable. And at the center of the storm stood Caroline Astor, silent, immaculate, unassailable. She never confirmed the number. She never uttered the phrase. She never published a list or granted an interview or gave the faintest public acknowledgement. But behind the doors of 355th Avenue, she understood what had happened. A private reign had become a public myth. Caricaturists drew her with a tiara, a scepter, a throne made of calling cards. Columnists called her queen without irony. Her dinners were dissected as affairs of state, her invitations studied like royal decrees. Caroline met it all with perfect stillness. She had been raised to believe that true power did not announce itself. That dignity was the art of holding the world at arm's length. That memory, not money, was the fortress of Knickerbocker, New York. And yet even she could not deny the genius of McAllister's invention. With one careless phrase, he had built her a moat, a velvet rope drawn across the city, elegant and invisible, a boundary that told the rising billionaires, yes, you have marble, yes, you have railroads, but you will not have this. Not yet. Inside the ballroom, the 400 floated on music and champagne and polished restraint. Outside, the city watched, whispered, schemed. And McAllister? He preened like a peacock at Caroline's side, the oracle of belonging, the bard of a world balanced, for now on its own vanishing point. But Caroline knew better. She could feel it in the footfalls on Fifth Avenue, in the gold veining the marble uptown, in the restless glitter of eyes that wanted not just admission, but conquest. The 400 was not a fortress. It was a challenge. And the storm was already at the gates. It began with a card, cream-colored, thick as linen, engraved in gilt script so fine it seemed whispered, Mrs. William Astor requests the pleasure. No address. No time. No RSVP. If you needed those things, you were not invited. The Aster Ball was not a party. It was a passage, a benediction, a coronation bestowed by candlelight. To cross the threshold of 355th Avenue on a winter evening in the 1880s was to be received into a world beyond wealth, a world of memory, manners, and myth, where the new money of the age came, not to conquer, but to be consecrated. Outside, Fifth Avenue lay hushed in the frost. Footmen guided sleighs through the snow like gondoliers on a white canal. Gas lamps flared against the gloom, catching the shimmer of diamond hairpins and the dull gleam of monocles. Guests arrived not in haste but procession. One did not tumble into Mrs. Astor's house. One arrived, and inside the theater unfolded. The house itself, tall, narrow, brownstone, gave no hint of what lived within. Caroline had designed it with the precision of a surgeon and the severity of a magistrate. The effect was never opulent. It was orchestral. A forest of white candles, trimmed to exact heights, burned against mirrored walls, doubling the light into infinity. Gold cornices curled along the ceilings. Silk panels swayed faintly with the draft of movement. Everything, from the imported palms to the arrangement of chairs, had been measured to the inch. The ballroom, 2 stories high, glowed like the inner chamber of a Fabergé egg. Musicians, hidden behind a bank of greenery, played Strauss and Waldteufel until the evening itself seemed to sway in 3/4 time. The supper room, never called a dining room here, offered consommé in fine porcelain, oysters crushed on cracked ice, champagne poured into fluted crystal, and menus written in French so delicate it nearly dissolved in the candlelight. But this too was ritual. One did not come to eat. One came to be seen and remembered, and Caroline remembered. She stood near the door, never far from the grand staircase, in black satin, her diamond stomacher burning like a constellation. She did not move much, did not smile often, but she saw everything. Her eyes flicked across the room with the precision of a general reading a battlefield. A hem too short, a curtsy too deep, a joke told in the wrong tone. She missed nothing. If she offered her hand, it meant one thing. If she withheld it, that meant everything. Men bowed, women bent their heads. No one rushed, no one spoke above a hush. At Mrs. Astor's, silence was not awkward, it was authority. The 400 came and went in murmurs of taffeta and cologne. Old names clustered around the edges of the ballroom, faces set in expressions of mild amusement. New names, if allowed at all, hovered at the periphery like pilgrims before a shrine. The few who made it into the heart of the room did so only after years of maneuvering, married to a Livingston, a Schermerhorn, or a line drawn directly from a Dutch ship manifest. Even the flowers were hierarchies. Only white roses. No lilacs. Never tulips. Tulips, Caroline believed, were common. The evening moved like a tide. Dances began with the cotillion, ended with the waltz. Young women, veiled in tulle and ambition, circled the room like planets around the fixed star of their chaperones. Young men measured themselves against glances. Conversations danced too, always gliding away from money, vulgarity, politics. One talked of art, of Paris, of discreet inheritance. But beneath it all, a current. Everyone felt it. The mounting presence of change. And yet, here, in this moment, in this house, Caroline held it back. She never danced. She never lingered. When the hour struck, she withdrew, not announced, not applauded. She simply vanished into the upper floors, leaving the city below to wonder what it had witnessed. Because a ball at Mrs. Astor's was not something you remembered. It was something that remembered you. Caroline ruled as though time still obeyed her, but time, like money, had other loyalties. She had reigned alone until Alva built a throne. By the early 1880s, Fifth Avenue no longer whispered. It thundered. The city Caroline had once ruled by silence now pulsed with brass and bluster. Steamships howled at the docks, telephones shrilled in marble foyers, and electric lights danced over fortunes conjured from oil, copper, railroads, and sugar. The old brownstones, stately reserved, were dwarfed by marble mansions trimmed in gold leaf and crowned with turrets. It was not a change. It was a coup. At the vanguard stood the Vanderbilts. Commodore Vanderbilt had died as the richest man in American history, and still, Caroline had not called. The money was vulgar, the rise too swift, the pedigree non-existent. The Vanderbilts may have laid the tracks that powered America, but in Caroline's world, a railroad could not carry you into society. It began, as revolutions often do, with a refusal. The year was 1879. And New York's Gilded Age glittered like a diamond, brilliant but cut to a merciless edge. At its center sat Mrs. Astor, still and serene, as if the city spun only because she permitted it to turn. And when she declined to call on the Vanderbilts, a family whose fortune now eclipsed her own, she was doing more than snubbing newcomers. She was drawing a line in stone. But what happens when a stone is struck long enough by steel? In Alva Vanderbilt, that steel had a name. Born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama, to a family ruined by the Civil War and rebuilt in the salons of Paris, she was a paradox. Southern by birth, French by finish and imperial in instinct. Her mother, a Creole beauty, had taught her elegance. The war had taught her hunger. And when she married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, she did not just join the richest family in America. She took command of its future. Alva had no patience for waiting rooms, and Caroline Astor had made society one long vestibule, guarded by silence, ritual, and remembrance. But Alva read the game for what it was, war by etiquette, and she played like a general. She began not with people, but with stone. At 665th Avenue, she commissioned a palace, not a house, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, America's first formally trained architect, and a man whose education made him fluent in the visual vocabulary of conquest. Together, they created a chateau that sneered at restraint. 3 stories of limestone filigree, balconies wrought like lace, a grand staircase with a curve so precise it felt choreographed. Inside, she layered silks, velvet, and bronze, hired Florentine carvers and Parisian artisans, and cast herself not as a hostess, but as a sovereign. Her dinners became the city's most whispered-about events, not because of who attended, but because of who didn't. Old names who thought themselves unassailable found their invitations lost in the post. Meanwhile, minor Knickerbockers, the third daughters of faded families, the under-financed cousins of better-born names, were brought in, flattered, dazzled, made loyal. She funded charities. She sponsored art exhibitions. She made the opera her court and the press her herald. Her receptions became showcases not just of wealth but of spectacle, of ceilings painted like Versailles, of 12-course dinners with music between the entrees. And yet still, Caroline did not call. The silence was deliberate. Her refusal was not born of ignorance. She knew what Alva was doing. Everyone did. But in Caroline's mind, money alone did not a lady make, and she would not recognize a Vanderbilt by force. And the guest list would be strategic. 1,200 of the grandest names, new money, old money, foreign dignitaries, tycoons, nobles, names chosen not merely for birth or money, but for the visibility their presence would provide. But one name was not on the list. Caroline Astor. It was, in Alva's mind, a simple equation. Carrie Astor, Caroline's daughter, must attend, but she could not unless Alva received her mother's card. And Caroline, if she allowed her daughter to be excluded from the grandest event in New York's memory, would risk public humiliation, a wound to pride no matron could survive. The trap was set. Newspapers began hinting at the scale of the affair. Designers whispered of their commissions. Young girls burst into tears at the thought of being left out. Mothers begged McAllister for help, but McAllister, though loyal to Caroline, saw what was coming. As he later admitted, it was not a question of receiving the Vanderbilts, it was a question of being received by them. Caroline waited. Alva waited. All New York held its breath. Then, just days before the ball, Caroline Astor sent her calling card, not herself, never herself. But the card was enough. Alva called in return, and Carrie Astor received her invitation. It was done. Society, for all its hauteur, had blinked. Alva had broken the gates, not with grace, but with artillery, and inside the court of Mrs. Astor was no longer inviolate. A new queen was arriving, masked in velvet and victory. March 26, 1883, the night of the ball, Fifth Avenue glittered with anticipation. Gaslights flickered in the damp March air, casting golden halos across the slick pavement. The wind carried the scent of coal smoke, perfume, and hothouse roses. Crowds pressed close to 665th Avenue, not to be admitted, but to bear witness. Beneath parasols and velvet collars, they strained to see the procession, gods and queens, harlequins and heroes, stepping from carriages into the blaze of Alva Vanderbilt's creation. The limestone chateau, modeled after the Hôtel de Ville in Blois, loomed like a fairy tale recast in stone. Its windows flared with electric and gaslight. Inside, the reception rooms shimmered in gold leaf and scarlet damask. Marble staircases twisted beneath frescoed ceilings, where cherubs cavorted among clouds and curls of painted sky. 10,000 roses, crimson, cream, and coral, breathed perfume into the air, arranged by French florists brought over for the occasion. Every doorway, every column, every inch of plaster was touched by intention. It was not a home. It was a fortress of spectacle. Outside, the city stood still. Inside, the world changed. 1,200 guests arrived in full masquerade. The society that once drew its elegance from understatement now drowned itself in fantasy. Restraint had been replaced, not by vulgarity, but by theater. Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, wife of Cornelius II, appeared as electric light, clad in silver satin, with a working Edison bulb glowing from a diamond-encrusted headpiece. A battery pack, sewn into the folds of her gown, was hidden beneath embroidered lightning bolts. Gasps followed her down the staircase. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess, her bodice encrusted with seed pearls, her eyes shadowed beneath a mask of gilded lace. Cornelius came as Louis XVI, powdered wig and all. Around them swirled knights, Tsarinas, sultans, harlequins, and gods of antiquity. There were helmets rimmed in ostrich plumes, tunics slashed in velvet and gold, fans of painted ivory flitting like moths above silk gloves. The ballroom throbbed with music and gaslight. Its gilt mirrors doubled the candle flames until the entire room seemed to burn. Footmen stood at rigid intervals, liveried in crimson and brass. The supper room gleamed with terrapin stew and canvasback duck, oysters mounted on crushed ice, Moet and Chandon poured into fluted crystal. Satin draped the walls. Orchids climbed the banisters. Even the chairs had been custom embroidered with each guest's monogram. But this was no mere party. It was a coronation. The room swelled with names that, even a season earlier, would have sniffed at a Vanderbilt invitation. The Livingstons were there. The Morgans came. The Schermerhorns nodded with polite disdain, but they came. Some sent representatives, unwilling to appear, but unwilling to be absent. Attendance was no longer a courtesy. It was a calculation, and among them was Carrie Aster. She wore pale pink silk, violets clustered at her sleeves, and pearls stitched into the hem of her skirt. She did not smile. She did not need to. Her presence said everything. The card had been sent, the door had opened, the siege had succeeded. The newspapers the next morning were reverent. The Times wrote of unprecedented elegance. Town Topics called it the most brilliant private entertainment ever given in America. No one disputed it. There was nothing left to dispute. The Vanderbilts had arrived. They were no longer knocking. They were inside. Soon, Alva turned her attention to her daughter Consuelo, not to launch her in New York, but to marry her into the British aristocracy. She had outflanked Caroline Astor on Fifth Avenue. Now she would cross the Atlantic. But that is another video. For now, though, the rules had changed, and everyone, even Caroline, would have to learn them. Under the blaze of Alva Vanderbilt's ball, the old order splintered, but Caroline Astor did not fall. She tempered, iron in a white heat, reshaping herself, redrawing the cartography of power with a steadier, surer hand. That single calling card delivered to 660 Fifth Avenue was no flag of surrender. It was a calculated incision, the cut of a surgeon who knows both the artery and the knife. By acknowledging Alva, she did not concede her reign, she preserved it. Inside her salons, the century did not advance. It paused, hushed, obedient. If Alva dazzled, one observer murmured, Caroline defined. But beyond her curtains, New York accelerated. Gaslight yielded to filament. Broadway hissed and hummed. Headlines learned to pant. The press, once deferential, began to bay like hounds for the warm scent of the newly rich. What Caroline had once accomplished with the lift of a brow now demanded spectacle, illumination, noise. The city was discovering its new religion, display. And then the blow, not from Alva, but from within. Carrie Aster, sweet-faced, steel-laced, fell in love with Marshall Orme Wilson, Southern Catholic, charming, and intolerably Vanderbilt adjacent. This was not merely unsuitable. It was sacrilege. Caroline forbade the match. Carrie refused the refusal. The mansion went still, the parquet and paneling seeming to strain under the silence. Mother and daughter moved like silhouettes through a dimmed palazzo, weaponizing quiet. New York watched. New York whispered, had the queen lost dominion over her own blood? Months calcified. Opera boxes glared at each other across tiers of velvet. Trinity's pews filled with auditors measuring the velocity of the Astor fall. Alva smiled like a woman who had scented the first fracture in an empire. and then finally, Caroline yielded. November 18th, 1884. Grace Church. Gothic arches stood like sentinels. The stained glass wore November's bruised light. The invitations bore the Astor crest. The guest list gleamed with armorial varnish. Ulysses S. Grant moved through the nave with the gravity of a man who had seen rougher battlefields. The bride glowed. The mother was alabaster. By the late 1880s, Caroline's own marriage had settled into parallel solitudes. William Backhouse Astor Jr., bookish, inward, distracted by yachts, observatories, and indiscretions, had long since ceded both burden and brilliance to his wife. Publicly, he was Astor. In truth, she was. April 25, 1892. Black crepe shrouded the windows. Mirrors were covered, as if reflection itself were indecent. William was gone, 65, indulgent but spectral long before death. Caroline moved through those rooms like an eclipsed moon. For weeks, marble steps lay unsullied by callers. Even the press withdrew, temporarily reverent before the sovereign of silence. When she emerged, the city inhaled. From head to hem she was black, her diamonds dimmed to mourning. She was not diminished, but transfigured. She was now no longer referred to as Mrs. Astor, but the Astor widow. Sensing twilight, she reached for permanence. With Ward McAllister at her side, she drew her line in ink and lineage, the 400. Not a list, but a liturgy. Not an inventory, but a canon. An assertion that space itself, her ballroom, her world, could be a sacrament of belonging. The press dissected it, half in awe, half in laughter. Some read it as scripture, others as fossil. But for one absolute, final moment, New York bowed. A card from 355th Avenue remained the passport to the old republic of pedigree. Then, 1893, grief more savage than any social slight. Helen Schermerhorn Astor Roosevelt, her quiet daughter, dead in Paris at 33. Married to James Roosevelt, stepbrother of Franklin. The marriage was unhappy. There were whispers, laudanum, fragile nerves, an overdose. A telegram crossed the Atlantic. A mother broke in silence. Curtains stayed drawn for months, the house dark as a tomb. Even the flowers in her mirrored halls withered, untouched. For the first time, New York glimpsed her not as a queen, but as a grieving mother, her power eclipsed by a sorrow too deep to name. And then, the public fall. Not hers, but the echo of it. Ward McAllister, her puffed and pompous herald, published Society as I Have Found It in 1895, a book so clumsy with vanity, it devoured its author. The press flayed him alive. The oracle became a joke. By year's end, he was gone, ridiculed, irrelevant, erased. His collapse was the anatomy of her era's decline in miniature, an age that mistook its codification for its permanence, freezing itself into myth while it was still breathing. Into the vacuum rushed a louder generation. Mammy Fish took the stage like a prima donna of provocation. She set a capuchin monkey at her dinner table, dressed as a prince. She greeted guests with a man cradled in a silver crib, cooing like an overgrown infant. "I wear pearls only when I don't care who lives or dies," she said, and the newspapers drank the line like champagne. Beside her rose the Silver Sisters, Teresa Fair Ulrichs and Virginia Fair Vanderbilt, turned tableaux vivants into rites of modern worship. Society girls, painted and poised as Botticelli's nymphs, stood motionless under arc-light halos while the press scribbled in ecstasy. The city had changed gods. The final stroke came exquisitely from the Vanderbilts. In 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alva's most polished weapon, married the Duke of Marlborough in a blaze of electric light at St. Thomas's. 7,000 people lined Fifth Avenue to watch the procession. Her pearl-encrusted gown did not shimmer. It blazed like a verdict. The message was unmistakable. The family once barred from her sanctum now wore coronets across the sea. By 1900, Caroline's dinners, flawless still, felt preserved in amber. The same French menus, the same baccarat, the same pauses between courses, the same careful tilt of her head. Once they had been acts of power. Now they were acts of remembrance. She would not speak to the press, but when asked, infuriatingly, about the new generation's capers, she replied, glacial, "Society is not a circus. It is not meant to amuse the newspapers." The newspapers laughed. For them, society had become exactly that. Into this clangorous modernity stepped her son, John Jacob Astor, Jack. Unlike his father, he was restless, inventive, attuned to the hum of the age. Where William Jr. had been content with ledgers, yachts, and a library's muffled quiet, Jack hectored the skyline. Jack's real passion was the city itself. He built the Astoria to challenge his cousin's Waldorf. Brick and marble argued across Fifth Avenue until competition surrendered to collaboration. In 1897, the two collided into the Waldorf-Astoria, the most luxurious hotel in the world. For Caroline, it was triumph and requiem in one. The Waldorf-Astoria rose on the very ground where her own brownstone had anchored the coordinates of society. Her house was destroyed to make way for the hotel's expansion. Her mirrored parlors, her damask, her ledger of power, raised, floor by floor, to make way for a palace of commerce and spectacle. It was the last quiet surrender of her reign. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died. Caroline read the cable in a quiet room. She had never met the sovereign, but admired her. A woman who ruled without apology, mourned without performance, endured without surrender. The Queen's passing felt like a mirror cracking. The age of name before noise, pedigree before pageantry, had drawn a last cool breath. She left her house rarely now. Not out of grief, but out of irrelevance. Fifth Avenue's air sang a new music. Ragtime, laughter, accents that had never passed her threshold. The calling cards lay thinner. The lamps were extinguished earlier. Her ledgers yellowed at the edges. She appeared for funerals and for weddings, rituals still honored even by a world that no longer believed in ritual. She moved slowly. Crepe whispered at her ankles. Diamonds lay quiet on her breast. Mothers pointed her out to their daughters in hushed, reverent tones. That is Mrs. Astor. That was once the height of the world. And with that whisper, the Gilded Age itself seemed to exhale and close its eyes. In October 1908, Caroline Astor died, and with her, a world let out its last soft breath. It was a world older than steel and glass, older than ambition dressed in diamonds, a world that still murmured the ghostly syllables of New Amsterdam. She was born into a city that was hardly a city at all, half village, half dream, with cobbled streets glistening in lantern light and Dutch names etched into the backs of church pews like half-forgotten prayers. Merchant dynasties ruled then, not with gold, but with memory, the invisible weight of lineage. Caroline Schermerhorn stepped into that quiet, candlelit order and, with a will that cannot be taught, bent it to her design. She was its pulse, its arbiter, its queen. And yet, across her lifetime, she watched it all dissolve like frost under a rising sun. Railroads cut their iron signatures across a continent. Copper wires unspooled through parlors, carrying voices from miles away. Electric light, vulgar and brilliant, tore the velvet veil from Fifth Avenue nights. The skyline grew impatient, thrusting itself upward from modest steeples to towers of steel. And with this rush came the oil barons, the railroad kings, men who conjured fortunes from soot and smoke, and their wives, desperate for an audience with the Mrs. Astor. She did not dazzle them with excess or noise. She ruled with silence, with a single engraved card, severe as a verdict. A gesture could anoint, a glance could erase, but time, with its merciless tide, began to wash even her fortress into sand. The 400, once her flawless creation, became a newsroom joke, the punchline of a city that now chased headlines, horns, and speed. Fifth Avenue, where her carriage wheels once traced the map of power, sprouted storefronts like weeds. Brownstones were gutted, stripped of their soul, razed to rubble. Where the tilt of her chin had been law, the new century shouted with engines and electric bulbs. When she died, New York did not lower its voice. No crepe darkened Fifth Avenue. The newspapers, respectful but detached, called her the Queen of New York society, as though naming a ghost. The city, that great animal of appetite, turned the page without hesitation. Her funeral was small, family, and the last of the old guard who remembered what it was to move by candlelight, to speak in whispers, to live in the hush before electricity. She was laid beside William, the husband who drifted from her parlors and her power, but never from her memory. No boasts on the stone, only names, dates, the faint, almost unbearable echo of a kingdom that had never needed to shout. After her, even the Astor name began to change its shape. In 1912, her son, John Jacob Astor, boarded the Titanic with his young bride. Iron struck ice in the black of night. He lifted her into a lifeboat, pressed a final kiss to her hand, and stepped back. Days later, his body was pulled from the Atlantic, crushed beneath a fallen funnel. The old world did not go gently. It went down with the band still playing, the music scattering like gold coins into the sea. By then, the ground had shifted. Alva divorced and marched for women's rights. Consuelo slipped her coronet and walked out of her gilded prison. War would soon rip the map apart. Borders redrawn, empires devoured, certainties burned to ash. And her ballroom, once the compass of a universe of whispers and glances, was dust. Hotels and steel bones rose where her chandeliers had thrown their honeyed light. The calling card gave way to the headline, the whisper to the shout. The chandeliers dimmed, the ledger closed, the last waltz faded, and New York, lit now by 1,000 hard, unblinking bulbs, did what it always does. It moved on. But in the ghost light of memory, she lingers. In the dust of demolished ballrooms, in the echo of strings no one hears anymore, in the stubborn brownstones, standing like old sentries along the park. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor. She was not the richest, she was not the loudest. But for one brief golden stretch, from the quiet streets of Knickerbocker, New York, to the roaring avenues of the Gilded Age, she reigned. And when she was gone, the age itself folded its wings and fell silent, while the city, insatiable, incandescent, swept forward, leaving only the faint perfume of her power in rooms that no longer exist. Thank you for watching this week's video on Caroline Astor, the formidable queen of the Gilded Age. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you rather live in the Gilded Age or in the quieter world of Knickerbocker, New York? Why? Do you think Caroline Astor was preserving tradition or simply afraid of change? If you could attend just one Gilded Age event, would you choose one of Caroline's flawless, candlelit dinners or Alva Vanderbilt's extravagant Masquerade Ball? And who fascinates you more, Caroline, with her quiet, absolute power, or Mammy Fish, the chaos queen who tore up the rulebook? If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing, leaving a like, or sharing your thoughts below. As a small channel, your voice matters, and so does your presence. Let me know which women you'd like to see featured in future videos. At Mythic Women, we don't just tell stories, we reclaim them. Each video is a thread in the great tapestry of history, carefully restored and woven with the dignity these women deserve. In a world driven by algorithms that reward outrage and fleeting scandal, you chose depth. You chose memory. You chose to bear witness. To our subscribers and patrons, our mythic men and women, thank you. You're not just viewers. You are stewards of memory, guardians of forgotten brilliance. Without you, these stories would remain buried beneath dust and silence. Because together, we're not chasing trends. We're keeping history alive. A special thanks this week to Anastasia Yatsenuk. Over the past year, she has lent her time and heart to helping me edit these videos. This is her last one, so please join me in giving her a warm goodbye in the comments. And as always, a heartfelt thanks to our patrons and channel members, the silent pillars who make this work possible. Velocity Girl, ZenLife68, Jillian Barker, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafam Chung, Deborah Himes, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Amanda Lynn, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Jules Mack, Maureen Tommen, Beth Dawson, DDH, Kimberly Ray, Stephanie Warren Smith, Monica, Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Supreme, Joya, Steve Weinstein, Deborah Chmielewski, Anna Livy, Roxanne Schuster, Kathleen Martin, Marina Barron, Melissa Pouliot, Kelly Bowen, Gwen, Melissa Gilmore, Kelly Patwell, Marsha Corbin, Randy Fox, Lucy Gonzalez, Curious Traveler, Deb Fisher, Indira Betcha, Dreaming of the Kingdom, Sumari Henderson, Michaela Rihanna, Sarah Blyberg Stanton, Will Kolb, Liz Karen, Maria Corrali, CTS Bathory, Snowball, Kendra McNally, Ida Kloster Jensen, Beth Dawson, Joanne Thomas Yaketo, Laura Lamond, Marina Barron, Real Steel Magnolia, Janet Phelps, Catherine Rotensky Harrison, Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, Michael Nelson, Karen Craig, Catherine Davison, Murphy's Bed, Lynn Sharp, Michelle Griffin McGregor, M. King, Virgie R. Nelson, Michelle Inman, Jamie Sue Kalamazoo, Susan Harris, Gus the Cat, PB, Jen Kin, Michelle Lynn Neal, Michael Dean Augustin, Black Knight 5897, Wendy Fairfull, Trudy DeSwart, Susie Work, Deborah Britton Offer Pitchick, Kate Lynch Ram, Fiona McDougall, Julianne Scovern, Sashi, Amy Johnson, Patricia Ahmad, G, and Kathy Harris. JK, Barbara Greckus, Susan Gillen, Hello Kitty, Abby Henriksen, Kathy Percival, Julie Woith, Melody, Xander and Shannon, Donna Pazilico, Ashley Kane, Tracy Wilson, Jody Mamenga, Leanne, Eoin Carivian, Tiffany Bristow, Marina Fideli, Virginia Frazier, Cindy Morton, Libby Armstrong, Tashwiz, Albert Norman LaBeouf, Nance Deneen McDougald, Carol Schrodel, Marina Fideli, Virginia Frazier, Catherine Wolfe, Elle Stadler, and Libby Armstrong. And to all the silent viewers out there, the men and women who watch until the last note plays, thank you. Until next week, stay curious, stay strong, keep exploring history, and as always, thanks for watching Mythic Women.